Pamela Olson grew up in a small town in Oklahoma and studies physics and political science at Stanford University. She lived in Ramallah for 2 years, during which she served as a head writer and editor for the Palestinian Monitor and as a former press coordinator for Dr. Mustafa Barghouti's in 2005 presidential campaign. In January of '06, she moved to Washington, D.C. and worked on a Defense Department think tank to try to bring what she had learned to the Hall of Power and Education, but disillusioning experience. She's currently working on a sequel to Fast Times in Palestine, called Palestine, D.C. So that's your book that you wrote this year, 2013, I thought, that Fast Times in Palestine. And, it seems like this is a new experience in that 2 years in Ramallah. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Okay. When you were there, the idea of the book, how did it come about?
Yeah, it's an enormous challenge. For the first part of your question, why did I have the idea to write the book? Part of it is the first time I came back from Palestine in 2003, after I'd spent only 5 weeks in the West Bank. I tried to tell my friends and family what I had experienced, what I had seen, the good and the bad, the amazing hospitality and the amazing friends that I'd made in Palestine, and the horrible, of course, injustice of the occupation that I had witnessed. And they tended to say, "Oh, you're crazy. You've been brainwashed. They just told you what you wanted to hear." And I say, really, I met hundreds of people. They all are in concert, just in this sort of conspiracy to tell me what I want to hear. I wasn't a journalist. I was just a tourist at the time, so there's no reason to try to fool me in particular. But everyone says, "Oh, I watch CNN. I watch Fox News. I watch whatever. I know what's going on." It's not like that. And so I realized, well, the first thing I needed to do was learn a lot more, and that's why I went back and lived there for 2 years. And by that time, what I realized is what's really missing in the U.S. is, there's an entire framework built to support the Israeli narrative, and there's almost nothing to support the Palestinian narrative, so that most Americans have no vision of Palestinians other than as, victims or perpetrators, never just as human beings. So I wanted to write my story to show, how it all came about, how my mind became changed. And it's clear in the book, it's not random people telling me what they want me to hear. It's very, visceral experiences and meaningful friendships that developed when I was nobody. I was in no position to influence anyone. So there's no reason that they should have, tried to fool me about what their situation is.
For you. So as a person that, as you admitted, that you didn't know much about the Arab culture, the Islamic culture, so you went there, and you must have like an idea what the Arabs are, what Palestinians are, from living in this country for 24 or 5 years. So I'm sure this is created a conflict between what you perceived and what you see.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a huge, and that was part of there's many things that drew me to come back and keep living there and studying it. But one of them is just a massive conflict between what I've been told all my life and what's actually there once you go and have a look. And in chapter 10 of the book, I bring my parents over to Palestine for a visit. And and part of the reason was I just wanted them to know that I wasn't crazy and I wasn't exaggerating and what's happening and what's going on and how I'm changing. But really, there's nothing like seeing it for yourself. And when they saw it for themselves, it's just like that. They understood things much, much better. And they never accused me of exaggerating again, which was really nice.
Do you think this is, would be the case with most of Americans? It's just a matter of they are misinformed, or their sympathy with Israel is beyond that? Like,
I really wish I could take everyone there to see it for themselves, and at least, whatever their mind ends up deciding, at least it should be based on truth, and both sides of the truth, not just one side of the truth, which currently only one side of the truth is mostly, revealed in the United States media and culture and everything else. As far as why the U.S. is so pro-Israel, part of it is religion, certainly. Like, everybody's read the Bible or at least watched the movie with Charlton Heston about, the Ten Commandments, or watched the movie with Paul Newman called Exodus. our culture is steeped in biblical references, the Promised Land, and not only that, but uh, every American, and rightfully so, learns about the Holocaust, and every school child reads the Diary of Anne Frank, and this creates very natural human empathy, and as it should. But unfortunately, a lot of that empathy is exploited by organizations that want to keep the Palestinian narrative from ever surfacing. And so what they do is, I mean, one of their tactics is if you try to, offer a view of Palestinians that doesn't fit with their narrative, they'll call you anti-Semite or say, oh, you're against Israel, or, all these different ways of trying to, shut you down. And it's very effective. I mean, it's been very effective for many years. It's getting a little bit less effective, but it's very, I'll give you another example. I gave a talk at a university, a major university that I can't name, but the professor who they talked with, who's an expert on the Middle East and who knows what he's talking about, he said, thank you for coming and being so honest about your experience in Palestine. I know everything that you're saying, but I can't say it to my students because we have certain donors whose names are on the buildings who get very upset when I try to speak in this way. And the administrators of the university don't want to deal with it. So in effect, I get censored. And this is a very common occurrence among many people that I've spoken with.
Uh, when you meet the Palestinian there, the average layman in the street, and then they know you are an American, I mean, you have some misgiving and some kind of fear about declaring your identity. But they really, as you said, they understand the difference between people and government, and they admit. I like when someone say, usually nice people have bad government. So how did you just gradually, you became the American writer and even working with a presidential candidate?
So when I first got there, you see in chapter 2, I was nervous to say I was from America, and so I told people I was from Oklahoma, and I got a really strange reaction. People would say, "Oh, Oklahoma, it's a dangerous place," and I would say, "What have you heard about Oklahoma?" I couldn't imagine, like cowboys and Indians or tornadoes or like, what did they hear? And they said, "Wasn't there a bombing, like a really big bombing, and lots of people killed?" And I'm like, "Well, yeah, one time 10 years ago. It's not like it's our everyday reality." But it just goes to show that if all you read about a place is in the news and its tragedies and calamities, it gives you a distorted view of what life is like in those places. And so it sort of helped me be a little bit more open-minded to learn about what's going on in Palestine, for example. So when I first went, as I said, I was a tourist. I didn't know anything. I just wandered in with a couple of guys that I had met in Jordan, kind of randomly. And we went to this village in the West Bank called Jayus, and I spent about 5 weeks there harvesting olives and teaching English, and being invited to dinner, to the iftar, the feast that ends the day of Ramadan, or the month of Ramadan. Every day there's a feast at the end of it. I gained so much weight during Ramadan. It's not, you think fasting you're going to lose weight. No, it's the opposite.
It's a day fasting. In the evening you eat.
Yeah, exactly. You fast during daylight hours, and then you feast and party until the wee hours of the morning. But so, but I was so intrigued by what I had learned and by the people that I had met that I wanted to come back. I didn't know exactly how I would come back, and I was out of money, so I had to leave. But when Dr. Mustafa Barghouti gave a speech at Stanford that spring when I was back in California, and he talked about his progressive political party, the Palestinian National Initiative, it all sounded great. And I wanted to know, okay, it sounds great, but is it actually great? Is it something that actually works on the ground? And if it works, is it something that can actually get some votes? And so that's why I went to volunteer with him, and then, later got the job as a journalist. And by that time, he, was familiar with the press and he knew that I could write. And so I was kind of tapped to be his foreign press coordinator when he ran for president after Yasser Arafat died. So it's kind of a series of steps. I kept being in the right place.
When you are there, do you get the feeling, or how did you deal with the fact, I don't know, call it white privilege? How people treat you. Do they treat you different? How do you feel about the way the Israelis, soldier and checkpoint, treat you as opposed to the Palestinian?
Of course, I mean the first and most basic injustice is the simple fact that I can go to Palestine and millions of Palestinians can't. They're not allowed. by the Israeli government to go at all. Every time I would visit Jordan, about two-thirds of the population is Palestinians who were driven out of their homes in Palestine, and they're not allowed to go back, not even to visit. So the fact that I can travel freely in Palestine and Israel, which was Palestine before 1948, I mean, that's the first. It's almost inconceivable. It's really hard to wrap your head around that reality. And then once you're inside, of course, because you're an American, you don't need a permit to travel. You don't need a visa to. You don't need permission from the Israeli government to travel away from, to go back home or to go to another country or to go get a scholarship. And it's not your sister, it's not your mother, it's not your brother and father who's being treated this way that you have to watch all the time. When my mother came and she was mistreated by a soldier at one point, I got so angry I almost couldn't control myself, and that I realized this is really what Palestinians go through all the time. It's their closest family members who have to deal with this. So even though I was next to Palestinians, living among Palestinians, you can't compare what I was living compared to what they were living. It's a very different experience of the occupation.
All you hear about the Palestinian, as you said in your book, is just when there is a bomb, when there is a violence. So how a book like you talks about the human aspect of the Palestinians be read?
Well, that's the reason I structured the book as a coming-of-age travelogue, because it's Americans like to read stories of other Americans going abroad to exotic locations and having an awakening and maybe a romance and that kind of thing. But they wouldn't probably read the book if it had been called The Truth About Palestine or something. People probably wouldn't have read it. They would have assumed it was polemic and probably biased. But if you put it in terms of a coming-of-age memoir, it's harder to screen bias because it's my own experiences, my own feelings, my own friends, that I'm talking about. And then also, of course, as I mentioned, the citations are largely Israeli. So if you're not, if you don't agree with me, that's fine. But take it up with, a columnist at Haaretz who said the same thing. Surprisingly, I've gotten very few negative comments about the book, other than a few sort of trolls who see the P word, the word Palestine in the title, and immediately call me an anti-Semite or something. But that doesn't bother me. That's just a knee-jerk reaction. But for people who've actually read the book, the response has actually been very positive, even from people who are Jewish, even from some people who are Israeli who have read it. So I really hope it can reach those people who don't know anything, just like I didn't know anything before the events of the book took place.
When you are there, I know everybody knows the historical nature of the conflict, politics. Two people have rights to one piece of land, biblical, God getting in real estate business and promising people real estate. So we know the macro out of this. But when you lived there for a couple of years, what kind of conflict do you see? What's the nature of conflict there?
Well, one of the first things that I saw when I was there is this wall that Israel is building. And in the village of Jayus, the wall, when it was first built, isolated 75% of the village's land from its owners, and a new settlement had already been built on that land. And these Palestinian owners of the land had to get permits in order to cross the wall. And that's if the soldiers showed up that day and allowed them to cross the wall, to get to their trees, their greenhouses, their fields, everything else. And so what I watched was essentially, a process of slow ethnic cleansing. They're trying to make it almost impossible for Palestinians to get to their land, or maybe the farmer can go but his son can't, or his wife can go but the farmer can't, or the farmer and his wife can go but their workers can't, so they can't get all the olives or all the the oranges or whatever they're growing. In one case, one of the largest landowners in Jayus, his son has a permit to go to Haifa for his export business, but the same son does not have a permit to go to his father's land in Jayus. So it's clearly not a security measure. I mean, if you look very closely, and I looked closely many, many times, it's not, and also the Israeli Shin Bet and army admitted it, but the wall is not about security. It's about securing land for settlements and for Israel, and also water rights. All of Jayus's water was isolated from its owners by the wall. and two of the largest settlements in the northern West Bank are built over aquifers. So, and then some friends of mine in JUICE, Israel's constructed all these settlement roads that crisscross the West Bank, and Palestinians can't access them and often can't cross them. And I knew two people in JUICE who could not visit their aunt who lived, 15 miles away because they couldn't use the settler road to get to her. And they didn't have an Israeli license plated car to use. And so I actually had to bring a friend from Israel, a Russian guy who had recently moved to Israel just a few years earlier, who had the Israeli plated car, who was able to transport them to visit their aunts. But just the absurdity of needing the help of a recent Russian immigrant to reach somebody who is your family member who's a few miles away. It's these kind of absurdities just multiplied over and over and over and over again. And of course, this breeds resentment, and that's the nonviolent part. There's also very violent aspects of the occupation. I talk about that in the book as well. But it's in the timeline of the book, on average, when I was a journalist, about 2 people died violent deaths every single day. Virtually all of them were Palestinians, very few Israeli deaths in this time period. And a child died of violent death about every other day. So it's just this constant, I don't know, the violence is constant, the oppression is constant, the fact that people can't move sometimes out of their village without a permit, much less get a job somewhere. A friend of mine, her husband was arrested for 1 year for a crime he obviously didn't commit. And a lot of these arrests are made just to wear down the population and make it impossible to have any kind of stability or security, and it makes people want to leave. And most of my friends who are characters in the book, they've all left. They couldn't get jobs. They didn't have freedom. They couldn't marry who they wanted to marry necessarily, and they all hope they'll go back. But every time I go back, it's more compacted, and Palestinians are driven off of more land and into smaller spaces with less of an economy available to them. So it's very difficult.
The Israelis that you met there, that they live there with probably the only land they know, they come from somewhere else, like your friend, the Russian friend. What do they think themselves?
There's a large spectrum of opinion in Israel. There's the sort of the middle ground are people who these days, because things are relatively quiet and the Palestinians aren't doing anything and the world isn't causing them too many problems about it, they're like, well, I guess the occupation's fine. And they'll talk about a two-state solution, but when it comes to doing anything about it, they don't actually do much about it. So de facto, they kind of just live their nice lives and let the situation go on and try not to think about it. On the right end of the spectrum are people who, they're essentially tribalists. They say, I've heard them say things like, one Jewish fingernail is worth all of them. A soldier said this to me, an Israeli soldier said this to me, essentially saying, my pinky finger is worth more than all of the Arabs in the world. And, this is a far-right mentality, but unfortunately more and more Israelis are having this kind of mentality where they really just don't care how many Palestinians are killed as long as they're secure in this, this land that they believe is theirs, and as long as there's not too much disturbance, and they just try not to think about what happens to the Palestinians, or they don't care. On the far left are Israelis who know exactly what's going on, who have no illusions about it, and who believe it's wrong, and who are working to make it better. But they're severely marginalized in Israeli society. And a friend of mine, Max Blumenthal, who just wrote a book called Goliath, about these trends in Israeli society, he compared them to pre-Civil War abolitionists. Like they're essentially saying Palestinians should have equal rights to Israelis in all spheres, and this puts them way out of the mainstream in Israel. So the question is, how can we support those people? And that's something my next book will talk about.
Interesting that with all this happening to the Palestinians who live there, all this daily hardship from moving, restrict their movement, restrict their living, restrict the water, restrict their, their life. How did you find their spirit?
Yeah, the tie to Palestinians to their land is something that I had never experienced before and never understood before until I saw it. But the way people tend their olive trees And the way they maybe plant them when when their grandfather was born, and then they've been tended for all of these years, and every year the whole family goes out to harvest, and it bonds them together, it cements them together. And there's other Palestinians who either now live or have lived on the beaches, on the coastal areas of what is now Israel, and that's a huge part of their life. It's a huge part of their history. Their songs, their dances, their costumes, their accents, like all of these things sort of play into who they are, and it's something remarkable and something beautiful. And when 750,000 of them were removed from this context, everything they owned was gone. It's really hard to measure what they lost. And the fact that 65 years later, in their camps, they're still speaking with their accents, they're still trying to create their dances and their uniform, their costumes, and singing their songs, and telling the story, and mapping out, this is where the mosque was, and this is where our house was, and this is where our trees were. It speaks to that tie to the land that's beyond what most Westerners really understand, and that's not going to just go away. It's not something you can just wait long enough and the old will die and the young will forget. Like, they're not forgetting. So there has to be a reckoning in some way or another for this injustice.
Well, Pam, thank you so much for giving us this time. I know you're coming here in Minneapolis on Saturday at 10 o'clock at Southdale Library. Hopefully, we'll see you here, and hopefully, that book will open a dialogue, at least for people to just know more. Well, thank you so much. In your new book, Fast Times in Palestine, and we wish you well, and we'll see you when you come here.
Thanks very much. I'm looking forward.